My parents sold my inheritance to fund my brother's wedding. Now they regret it after I claimed my share and disappeared completely. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I've always been the quiet one in my family. Growing up, I learned early on that keeping my head down and doing the right thing was easier than arguing for recognition that never came. I worked hard at school, saved every penny I could, and tried to help around the house whenever I wasn't buried in homework. My younger brother, Ethan, on the other hand, had this effortless charm. Teachers loved him, relatives fawned over him, and my parents would light up every time he did something minor, like scoring a B on a test or impressing a friend with a joke. Meanwhile, my achievements were often shrugged off, a nod and then back to praising him. We weren't poor exactly, but we were far from wealthy. Middle class in the truest sense. My parents stressed responsibility and the importance of hard work, yet somehow it felt like that advice was aimed more at me than Ethan. I dreamed of a small home of my own, of saving enough to invest in something meaningful, and part of that plan had been the inheritance my late grandparents had left me, a modest piece of land tucked on the outskirts of town, along with some savings they set aside to secure my independence. To me, it wasn't just money. It was a promise, a safety net, a tangible proof that someone somewhere believed in me. I tried not to let the favoritism eat away at me, but subtle things added up. My parents laughing harder at Ethan's stories, telling me I was too serious, or brushing off my accomplishments with a casual, "That's nice, but Ethan did this." It was the little things that stung, the quiet reminder that my future was secondary to my brother's happiness. I buried my frustration behind polite smiles and words of encouragement, convincing myself that patience and loyalty were virtues worth holding on to. And yet, beneath that quiet exterior, I felt a simmering unease, a sense that the life I was building, the careful plans I had nurtured, could be taken away in an instant. I didn't know it yet, but that unease was the first crack in what I thought was a solid foundation. I still remember the day I found out my inheritance had been sold. It's etched into my memory like a punch I never saw coming. I had gone over to my parents' house to discuss plans for the land, maybe figure out when I could finally start building something of my own. That's when my mom dropped it, casually, like it was nothing. "We sold the land, honey. Ethan needed it for his wedding." My stomach lurched, my heart hammering so fast I thought it might burst through my chest. "What do you mean sold?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My dad chimed in almost apologetically. "It's for the family, for Ethan. You know how important this wedding is." Important? My life, my plans, my hard work, all erased in the name of what? Their pride in him? I wanted to scream, to punch the nearest wall, to make them feel just a fraction of the betrayal clawing at me, but I only managed a quiet, "You didn't even ask me?" My mother's gaze didn't waver. "We didn't need to ask. It's for the family." Ethan had been standing there the whole time, grinning, oblivious to the storm I felt brewing inside. Every carefully nurtured plan I had for independence, every dream I had spent years saving for, had been swept away while I slept, figuratively. The next days were worse. I tried talking to them again, reasoning, pleading even, but it felt like speaking to walls made of stubborn guilt tripping. "We did it for you too," they insisted. "You'll understand when you're older." I understood perfectly. I understood that my worth, my future, and my dreams had been secondary all along. Even family friends unintentionally reinforced my pain, congratulating Ethan for the grand wedding, praising my parents for helping him out, while I sat quietly, my voice drowned out by applause I wasn't invited to join. By the end of that week, I felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out a piece of me and replaced it with rage wrapped in disbelief. My inheritance wasn't just money. It was a symbol of trust, of faith in me, and they had taken it without a second thought. I stared at the empty spot where my future should have been and realized this was only the beginning. I couldn't let it slide, not if I wanted to keep what little pride and dignity I had left. And in that moment, a quiet determination settled over me, a seed of resolve that would grow far beyond what they ever imagined. Ethan's wedding was a spectacle, and I felt like a ghost walking through my own family's celebration. The venue glittered with lights, flowers spilling over every table, and music that seemed to laugh at my quiet misery. I was there, technically part of the family, but every glance, every toast, felt like a reminder that the life I was supposed to have had been handed over to someone else. Ethan beamed constantly, unaware, or maybe uncaring of the storm he'd left in his wake. "Can you believe this place?" Ethan said, practically glowing. Mom and Dad really went all out for us. I forced a tight smile. Yeah, it's impressive. The words tasted bitter on my tongue. Around me, relatives whispered, laughed, and raised glasses to my brother, praising his charm, his choices, his perfect wedding. And there I was, the quiet one, the responsible one, watching the attention that should have once celebrated me get lavished on him instead. My parents floated through the crowd, radiant and proud, but every smile I caught on their faces felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Even the small things stung. The servers placed Ethan's plate first. The photographer lingered on him for group photos while I was shuffled into the background. My parents' subtle nudges, go say hi to the guests, felt more like dismissals than guidance. I tried to focus on the food, the decor, anything to distract myself from the unfairness glaring back at me from every corner. But it was impossible. I remember standing near the garden doors, the warm night air brushing my face, and thinking about the land that had been mine, the dreams I had carefully tucked away, now gone. I clenched my fists under my jacket, tasting my own fury and disbelief. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about recognition, respect, and the simple fact that my parents could erase my future without a second thought. As the music swelled and the crowd cheered Ethan on, I realized I couldn't just stand by silently anymore. Something inside me shifted that night. I wasn't sure what form it would take yet, but I knew one thing. They hadn't seen the last of me. After the wedding, I retreated into a quiet rage I couldn't show anyone. Every night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying their words, their smug faces, Ethan's oblivious grin. I realized that anger alone wouldn't fix anything. I needed a plan, something precise, something that would make them understand that taking what was mine wasn't consequence-free. I started digging. Legal avenues, paperwork, small loopholes, even conversations with old family friends who might know how the inheritance had been handled. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about reclaiming what had always belonged to me. I remember sitting in my small apartment, the hum of the city outside my window, the faint smell of coffee filling the air, and thinking about how careful I had to be. You're serious about this, huh? My friend Mike asked one evening, peering over my laptop. I nodded, barely speaking. Yeah, I can't just let it go. Every document I pulled, every tiny irregularity I discovered in the sale of my land made my pulse quicken. I began to see cracks in my parents' story, little things they assumed I wouldn't notice, signatures that didn't match, odd timing in bank transfers, vague explanations about how the money was used, and in those discoveries a strange calm began to settle over me. The helplessness that had eaten at me for weeks was slowly being replaced by focus and purpose. It was almost intoxicating knowing that for once I had the upper hand, but it was also terrifying. I couldn't let a single misstep ruin everything. Late that night, I stared at my phone, imagining calling them, confronting them directly. But I didn't. Instead, I typed meticulous notes, lined up evidence, and began to chart a path forward. I realized something then. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had patience, brains, and a legal claim, and I was going to use them, but as I finally leaned back, exhausted, I couldn't shake the feeling that this path I was stepping onto would change everything, and not just for them. I just didn't know how far it would go, or what they would do once they realized I wasn't the same quiet son they thought they could control. The cracks in my family's facade started showing almost immediately, though they didn't know I was watching. My parents began whispering more behind closed doors. Their voices sharp and tight with stress they tried to hide from Ethan. I overheard snippets of arguments as I visited for a friendly chat about other things. He's asking too many questions, my dad muttered once, pacing the living room. We can't let him dig, my mom hissed, clutching the couch cushions like a lifeline. Every word confirmed what I already suspected. They knew I was onto them, and the idea terrified them. Ethan remained oblivious, wrapped in his golden child bubble, bragging about minor achievements and indulgent gifts his parents had showered on him post-wedding. It was infuriating to watch, but it was also useful. Their fear, their overcompensation, gave me insight I didn't have before. I noticed how they avoided talking about money in front of me, how their smiles sometimes faltered, how even casual glances at my expressions betrayed panic. Little by little, I mapped the terrain, who had handled the sale, what they'd overlooked, and which friends or advisors might help me solidify my claim. At night, Alone in my apartment, I went over the numbers, the documents, and the irregularities I'd uncovered. The city lights filtered through my blinds, casting long shadows that mirrored my growing obsession. I felt the weight of every late-night calculation, every silent thought, every tiny clue adding up to something bigger, something I could use. My hands shook with anticipation, a mix of fear and adrenaline. But as much as I tried to stay calm, there was a constant ache in my chest. The ache of realizing my family could so casually erase my future and still sleep at night. And yet that ache began to fuel me. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about proving to them that I wasn't their quiet, passive son. I had a voice and I was ready to use it. Standing by the window that night, looking at the distant skyline, I made a silent vow. They had underestimated me for the last time. What they didn't know, and what I was only beginning to understand, was that the real reckoning hadn't even started. The day I filed the paperwork to reclaim my inheritance is burned into my memory, the moment I went from quiet resentment to decisive action. I sat across from the lawyer, a stern woman with sharp eyes who didn't tolerate excuses. "Everything checks out," she said, sliding the documents toward me. "Your grandparents' will clearly names you as the rightful heir. They can't override it without your consent." My stomach twisted, a mix of relief and anticipation. Finally, I had something tangible, a way to fight back. When I called my parents to tell them, I tried to keep my voice calm, neutral. "Mom, Dad, the land and funds, technically they're mine," I said carefully. Silence followed. Then my mom's voice, shaky and tight, broke through the line. We thought it was for the family, for Ethan." I let out a quiet laugh, low and bitter. "It was for me," I said simply. "You can't just decide to give my future away." My dad's muttered threats were barely audible, the kind meant to intimidate someone, but they sounded hollow. Ethan, of course, had no idea the storm brewing. He wandered into the living room, laughing, holding a champagne glass, still celebrating post-wedding excess. "Relax, it's just paperwork," he said, clueless. I clenched my jaw, my hands shaking, not from fear but from the power surging through me. Every tiny slight, every overlooked achievement, every condescending remark they had ever made, they were all about to meet reality. The process wasn't easy. Meetings with lawyers, late-night phone calls, document after document, each step required focus and precision. I felt a strange exhilaration, like a long-dormant fire finally flaring. And then, when the legal claim was officially recognized, my parents' faces fell. Shock, disbelief, panic. They tried to negotiate, guilt trip, even bribe, but it was too late. For the first time, I saw them not as untouchable authority figures, but as fallible, scared people. Their arrogance, their favoritism, their dismissal of me, it had led them to a confrontation they hadn't anticipated. And deep down, I savored that moment even though the storm was far from over. They had underestimated me. And now, for the first time in my life, the scales were tipping. I thought reclaiming the inheritance would feel like victory. But the moment I walked away from that legal office, a heavy emptiness hit me. My parents didn't yell or scream, they simply withdrew. Calls went unanswered, messages ignored, visits suddenly inconvenient. Ethan, once gleeful and untouchable, now glared at me with thinly veiled anger, blaming me for ruining everything. It was surreal. For weeks, I felt like I was walking through a ghost town of the family I thought I knew. At first, I tried to reach out, hoping to bridge the gap, explain my side calmly. But every attempt ended in guilt trips, cold shoulders, or thinly veiled insults. "We only did it because we love you," my mom insisted one evening over the phone. I hung up, heart pounding, unable to stop the tears from falling. Love? That word had lost all meaning. I felt completely alone, a son punished for standing up for himself. Even friends noticed the change in me. I'd grown quieter, more withdrawn, and sometimes I caught myself staring at the city skyline, imagining a life without the weight of family expectation. Nights were the hardest. The apartment felt smaller, the hum of the streetlights outside louder, the silence pressing against me like a living thing. I'd lie awake, thinking about all the years I'd patiently endured favoritism, disrespect, and subtle humiliation, years that felt meaningless now that I was cut off completely. It was in those nights of isolation that I realized something terrifying. Reclaiming my inheritance hadn't restored my life. It had shattered it in a different way. The people I loved or thought I loved were gone, replaced with resentment and fear. I had what was mine legally, but emotionally I was at my lowest point. And yet, amid the pain, a tiny spark remained. A spark that whispered, "This isn't the end. You can still take control. You can still win on your own terms." I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let them see me broken. That night, as I stared at my reflection in the dark window, I made a silent promise. They would regret underestimating me completely. I packed the last of my belongings into my car and drove away from the house that had always felt like a cage. The city lights blurred past as I felt, for the first time in years, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. My inheritance was finally mine, and with it a chance to rebuild everything on my own terms. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but that uncertainty felt freeing rather than suffocating. Finding a new apartment wasn't hard, but making it feel like home took time. The hum of the street outside became a comfort instead of background noise, and the smell of fresh paint mingling with furniture I had chosen myself reminded me I was building life on my own terms. For the first time, I could make decisions without guilt, without whispers from my parents reminding me of my place in the family hierarchy. Each small act, cooking my own meals, arranging my space, even opening mail without tension, felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that had been buried for decades. Friends noticed the shift in me. "You seem lighter," Mike said one evening as we shared beers on my balcony. I shrugged, looking at the skyline stretching endlessly beyond us. "I finally have control over my life," I admitted quietly. It wasn't bragging. It was relief. I had taken what was mine, and while my family floundered in the chaos they'd caused, I was building stability, independence, and peace. Every so often, I'd hear about them, snippets from mutual friends or distant relatives. My parents were tense, stressed, and most importantly, realizing the cost of their choices. Ethan was frustrated, no longer the untouchable golden child, facing consequences they hadn't anticipated. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The simple fact that they couldn't manipulate me anymore, that I had walked away on my own terms, was enough. One night, as the wind carried the distant hum of the city below, I sat on my balcony and let it sink in. I was free. The weight of years of quiet suffering, dismissal, and betrayal was slowly lifting. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was alive. But I knew they would come to regret underestimating me. And when that realization fully dawned on them, the balance of power would shift entirely. It wasn't long before I started hearing whispers about my family's mounting stress. The lavish wedding they had splurged on had drained more than just their wallets. They'd overcommitted, mismanaged, and now even Ethan was feeling the pressure. Friends who had once praised them for their generosity now quietly shared their struggles with me, as if confirming what I had already suspected. My parents were finally seeing the consequences of their actions. I didn't feel joy or schadenfreude, just a quiet satisfaction that the tables had shifted, even if subtly. My phone buzzed with a message from an old family friend. "Your parents are worried. Not sure how to reach you." I didn't respond. I let the thoughts sit with me, letting them stew in their own regret. I walked through my apartment, running my fingers along the furniture I'd chosen, the shelves I'd built, the sense of order that contrasted sharply with the chaos I had left behind. Every detail reminded me that independence was far sweeter than I had imagined. Ethan, too, began showing cracks. The smugness that once made him untouchable was replaced with irritation, tension, and unease. He tried to act normal, to keep up appearances, but even the neighbors noticed. The pressure that my parents had shielded him from now pressed down, and I watched from a distance as reality began to take shape around him. I began to reflect on everything I had endured, the favoritism, the dismissals, the quiet humiliation, and for the first time, it didn't sting in the same way. I'd proven to myself that patience and intelligence mattered more than charm and entitlement. The injustice had been painful, yes, but the lesson was mine to keep. Strength comes from standing up, even when you feel completely alone. As I looked out over the city skyline that evening, the wind carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves, I realized the most powerful victories aren't loud or flashy. They're quiet, deliberate, and irreversible, and I could almost see the panic beginning to set in on the other side, even if they didn't know it yet. But I wasn't done. Not yet. There was one final revelation left, one that would make them fully understand the consequences of their choices. Then came the message that completely shifted everything. A distant relative I barely spoke to reached out with information that my parents had never considered I could discover. Financial mismanagement, hidden debts, and favors they'd promised but never delivered. I read the message twice, heart racing, realizing that the web of their mistakes extended far beyond the inheritance. They had been so focused on Ethan's wedding that they had left themselves completely exposed, and I now held the knowledge that could solidify my position completely. I didn't respond immediately. I sat on my balcony, the city lights twinkling below, sipping coffee that had gone cold, thinking about how carefully I had to act. One wrong move and it could backfire, but every tiny detail in that message, every document and number, only strengthened my resolve. They had underestimated me for decades. Now, for the first time, I understood the full scale of their oversight. Ethan still had no idea. I imagined him bragging to friends, unaware that the very foundation his life was built on was wobbling. I smiled faintly, not cruelly, but with a satisfaction that comes from knowing you're untouchable. I was no longer just reclaiming what was mine. I was witnessing the ripple effects of their arrogance, their favoritism, and their reckless confidence. That night, I drafted a careful plan, charting each step to ensure my independence remained intact while letting them feel the weight of the consequences without direct confrontation. The thrill of control coursed through me, tempered by the awareness that I couldn't let it slip. I had learned patience, strategy, and timing over years of quiet suffering, and now it all came into play. As I finally leaned back, letting the cool night air wash over me, I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. I had risen from the depths of despair, reclaimed my future, and positioned myself in a way they could never have predicted. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the moment they truly understood the scale of their misjudgment would be the ultimate confirmation of my journey. But how they would react, and whether they could ever regain a shred of what they had lost, remained to be seen. Sitting in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to reflect on everything that had happened, the favoritism, the betrayal, the silent rage I'd carried for years. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about the lessons I'd learned, the strength I had cultivated, and the fact that I had survived a family system built to dismiss me. I thought about my parents' faces when they realized I couldn't be manipulated, Ethan's frustration, and the quiet panic that must be settling over them now. And for the first time, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. I replayed the moments in my mind, the casual dismissal of my accomplishments, the way my parents lit up for Ethan while my efforts were minimized, the wedding where my own future was quietly erased. At one point, I almost felt pity, but it was tempered by awareness. I had emerged from their favoritism, their negligence, and their manipulation stronger, smarter, and completely untouchable. My life was mine. I also thought about the people I had become distant from, not because I wanted to, but because I had to protect myself. The friends who had tried to mediate, the relatives caught in the middle. They had seen the unfairness too, but none had stepped in. And yet, in that solitude, I realized that isolation had forged resilience. I had learned patience, strategy, and the power of quiet determination. There was a strange satisfaction in watching from afar as my parents and Ethan faced the consequences of their choices. I didn't gloat. I simply observed. Every small ripple, the missed payments, the whispered frustrations, the occasional worried glance toward me, felt like affirmation that justice, even when delayed, had a way of balancing itself. And as I gazed out at the city skyline that evening, the wind carrying the faint hum of life below, I understood something profound. Life doesn't always reward the loudest, the flashiest, or the most charming. Sometimes it rewards the patient, the intelligent, and the ones who refuse to let injustice define them. And in that moment, I finally felt complete. But even with this calm, I knew the final chapter, my ultimate empowerment, was still waiting. I woke up one morning and realized something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Not the kind of freedom you talk about lightly, but the deep, resonant kind that comes from taking control of your life when everyone else assumed you'd stay silent forever. My inheritance was secure, my independence was solid, and the weight of their favoritism, manipulation, and betrayal no longer held me down. I could finally breathe. I moved into a new apartment, filled it with the things I loved, and built routines that centered entirely on me. Cooking my own meals, choosing my furniture, even deciding when to wake up and sleep, every small decision was a reminder that I was finally in charge. For the first time, I didn't have to justify my existence or my choices to anyone. The air smelled fresher. The city outside felt like a playground rather than a cage, and I could hear myself think without the constant hum of judgment. News of my parents' growing regret reached me slowly, filtered through distant relatives and casual encounters. I didn't need to respond. I didn't even want to. I simply let it be. Ethan's smugness had dissolved into frustration, my parents' calm arrogance replaced with unease. They had underestimated me for years, and now, watching from a distance, I could see the truth settling in. They had lost control, and there was nothing they could do to regain it. I reflected on the journey, decades of quiet patience, the sting of betrayal, the legal battles, and the nights I lay awake feeling utterly alone. And I understood something vital. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, it waits, it plans, and when it finally emerges, it's unstoppable. I wasn't seeking revenge, not really. What I had done, what I had survived, was more powerful than any retaliation. I had reclaimed my future, stepped away from toxicity, and built a life that no one could take from me. Sitting on my balcony that evening, the city lights stretching endlessly before me, I smiled. I was free, I was whole, and for the first time I was truly untouchable. Theirs was the regret. Mine was the life they could never destroy.